In this video, we'll speak about the anatomy and physiology of the blood vessels. Blood vessels are basically tubes that deliver blood from the heart to the tissue and back after the gas exchange to the heart. So it consists of arteries. There are three types of arteries. You have elastic artery, muscular artery, and arterial. Those are the three type of arteries that deliver blood away from the heart. And then you have a bunch of capillaries. There are two types of capillaries you have: continuous capillary and fenestrated capillary. The capillaries are the only blood vessels that allow gas exchange and nutrient exchange. After the molecules exchange the material between the blood and interstitial fluid, the blood is delivered back to the heart by veins. So there are three types of veins we have. The smallest one is venule, and then we have the medium-sized vein, and then we have the large-sized veins. So veins go and deliver the blood to the heart, and arteries from the heart. So now let's look at the arteries further. And let's look at the anatomy of the arteries and veins. Both arteries and veins are basically consist of three layers or three main tunicas, and those are tunica intima, tunica media, and tunica externa. So tunica intima which is the inner layer. That inner layer is this tiny layer that you see inside. This is the layer that actually touches the blood. This is the innermost layer. This layer is made up of elastic fibers and collagens. So it's elastic. If you look from the side, it's this thin layer. If you look from here, it's this thin layer, which is the intima. The next layer is the media. Tunica media is the middle layer. It's made up of smooth muscle and elastic fibers. Smooth muscles basically help the blood vessels to maintain their shape and hold their shape. This layer is, as you could see it from this diagram, right over here. So this layer over here, and if you want to look at it from the side, this layer right over here is the tunica media. So if you look at it here, that thin layer is tunica media. One of the things that you should notice over here, if you look right over here, this layer is very thin in veins and very thick in arteries. So compared to the veins, arteries have a thicker tunica intima layer, and you could see it right over here too. So if you look at this one versus right over here, it's much thicker in the arteries. The next layer or outermost layer, tunica externa. This layer is mostly composed of collagen and elastic fibers. Therefore, it's stretchy because it's elastic fibers, and that stretchiness helps blood vessels to expand and recoil back to their original form. This characteristic is very important as it would allow blood vessels to be flexible and maintain stability under the pressure of the blood flow. And that layer is basically, as you could see it, this outermost layer, which is red, shown in red in this picture in arteries, and this blue layer, which is shown in the veins. So those are the three layers of the arteries and veins. Now, what are arteries? Arteries are the blood vessels that basically deliver oxygen-rich blood from the heart. So if this was the heart, from the heart it delivers it to the organs and tissues. And at the organ and tissue, exchange occurs, and then that blood is, after the exchange, delivered by veins back to the heart. So it delivers oxygenated blood to the tissue. The only exception is the two arteries deliver deoxygenated blood, and those two arteries are pulmonary arteries, which take deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs, and the other artery is inferius, and that's umbilical arteries. All other arteries deliver oxygenated blood. So there are three types of arteries we have. So the arteries are basically divided or classified into three types. The biggest artery is the elastic artery, and those are the largest arteries, and they're basically called conducting arteries or conduit arteries. They have very thick middle layer, so they can stretch and respond to each pulse of the heart. They're more elastic tissue than the other two types. So elastic arteries have more elastic tissue compared to the muscular arteries and arterioles. That's why we call them elastic artery. And this is important because as the ventricles contract, they should be able to expand and basically absorb that pressure and then recoil back to their original shape. An example of this type of arteries is aorta, common carotid artery, brachiocephalic artery, for instance, like if you look at in this diagram, so you have right over here subclavian artery, you have common carotid artery, and we have brachiocephalic artery. And obviously the aorta, so right over here you have the heart, and from the left atrium the blood flows to the aorta. As it becomes an arch, three arteries branch out of it. So one artery is the brachiocephalic artery, and the second one is the common carotid artery, and the third one is over here that you have subclavian artery. So those three arteries branch, and then the aorta descends down. So aorta itself is basically an example of elastic artery, and those are also example of elastic artery. Now, as the aorta branches down, as you could see, aorta branches down, and you're going to see many other arteries branch. So you're going to see right over here, that's inferior mesenteric artery. If you look right over here, that's superior mesenteric artery. So those big arteries branch. So you could think of this aorta as an interstate highway, and as you exit basically to the liver, or exit or go to different towns and cities. And those are all examples of the elastic artery. So right over here, you see aorta comes down. So this is still aorta, and artery goes here. So that's renal artery goes to the kidneys, and the liver kidney, blood to the kidneys, and then they further branch to go to the lower limbs, left and right lower limbs. The second type of artery that you have is muscular artery. Those are called distributing artery. Those arteries are medium size. Most of the artery in our body is actually muscular artery. They have less elastic tissue and more smooth muscle compared to the elastic arteries and arterioles. Because they have less elastic tissue, they're less stretchable. But since they have more smooth muscle, they're better. They have better capability of contraction and constriction. So their function is to basically take blood from the elastic artery and distribute it to a specific area of the body. So basically what happens is that an artery will branch from the main elastic artery and go and deliver blood to this region. Another artery is going to branch and deliver blood to this region, and so forth. So different areas are supplied blood by this muscular artery. An example of the muscular artery could be, for instance, like radial artery, lunar artery. Like right over here, as you could see from this diagram, here is the lunar artery, here is the radial artery. So radial artery basically branches, brings the blood to this region, and lunar artery brings blood to this region. If you look at this diagram, for instance, like this is colon. So this is going to be colon artery and rectal, I'm sorry. This is going to be the rectal, and this is the rectal artery that delivers blood here. And this is the sigmoid part of the colon. So this is the sigmoid artery and delivers blood to that region. So the blood is basically taken by elastic artery, and then muscular arteries branch and deliver to different regions that blood. The third type of arteries are arterioles. So arterioles are the smallest division of the arteries that transport blood away from the heart. They basically direct blood into the capillary network that we call it capillary bed. And arterioles have a very thin tunica externa, and they have only a few layers of smooth muscle in the tunica media. They play a regulatory role in blood flow to a specific area that we're going to look at it later on. So that's going to be the third type of artery that directly connects to the arteriole. So right over here, if you look at it in capillaries, so this one over here is the capillaries. This is the capillary network, capillary bed. So this arteries that basically attach to the capillaries, those will be the arterioles. In the other end, those will be the venules that we're going to look at it in a second. So as you could see from this diagram over here, so arteries bring blood, so the blood comes here, the blood goes to the capillaries. So this is basically capillary bed right over here. What you see is the intensity of color decreases from red and becomes more blue, and that indicates basically the concentration of nutrient and oxygen. So red indicates more oxygen, more nutrient, and as it goes more to the blue, that means less oxygen. So oxygen basically flows out of the capillaries and enter the interstitial fluid. Nutrients is transported by diffusion, osmosis, filtration, facility transportation. So they basically leave the capillaries and enter the interstitial fluid, and then from interstitial fluid they go to the cells. Cells use them, produces oxygen, carbon dioxide diffuses into the blood vessels and then is transported back to the heart. So now let's look at the veins. So veins are the blood vessels that carry blood toward the heart. So basically, so if you look at it, this was the heart. Away from the heart to the capillary, some kind of exchange occur. Now this goes back to the heart. So all those blood vessels that deliver the blood after the exchange to the heart, those are called veins. Normally veins, or mostly veins, transport deoxygenated blood or oxygen poor blood from the tissue back to the heart. The only two exceptions is pulmonary veins, which deliver oxygenated or oxygen-rich blood from the lungs back to the left atrium, and umbilical veins that deliver oxygen-rich blood to the baby. Other than that, all the other veins deliver oxygen-poor blood. Veins could be divided based on their position in the body, either to deep vein, which means like they're located close deep into the muscles and close to the bones, or they could be superficial, which is located right under the skin. And then the third type could be connecting veins, which connects the superficial veins to the deep veins. As we said, there are three types of veins. So the smallest type of vein are venules. That's basically the smallest of the three veins. Basically have at most 2 layers of smooth muscles or no elastic tissue. After gas exchange at the capillaries, venules collect the deoxygenated blood and return them back to the heart. So basically some kind of what happened here? All right, so right over here some kind of gas exchange occurs, and after the gas exchange, let me change the pen. So right over here gas exchange occurs. After the gas exchange from the capillaries, blood is moving to the venules. So the very tiny vessels that receive the blood from the capillaries are the venules. So those are the first branch of the veins. The second one is medium-sized veins. So many venules, or hundreds of venules, basically drain into a single vein. So a venule comes from another capillary bed. So many venules come from capillary bed, and they all drain into a single vein, and that single vein is now medium-sized vein. So medium-sized vein basically collects the blood and the liver set or drains it into the large veins. For example, the same way that we said about the arteries, now if you look at the veins, blood from the kidney is collected by the renal vein and drained into inferior vena cava. So from this kidney, again, renal vein takes it. So blood goes from the kidney. This one that you see over here, that's the inferior vena cava. So blood from different parts just go and drain into that superior vena cava. So those are all medium veins that deliver blood to the inferior and superior vena cava. So in this case, this is inferior vena cava. This one will be superior vena cava. So when you look at it, for instance, like jugular veins deliver the blood from the head, and veins from the neck, and veins from the upper limbs, basically from the shoulder and upper limbs, will be delivered. And this one is the superior vena cava. So superior vena cava delivers blood to the right atrium, and from the lower portion, inferior vena cava brings the blood to the right atrium. So again, what you see over here is that hepatic portal vein, which is right over here. This one, hepatic portal vein takes the blood from the intestine, a nutrient from the intestine. So all the food that you eat diffuses to the capillary. So they cross from the intestine to the capillary, and then the capillary delivers it. So you have the mesenteric blood veins right over here that take the blood and delivers it to the hepatic portal vein, and the hepatic portal vein delivers it to the liver. So you see all this blood vessels are connected and going to the hepatic portal vein, so they could go. So food, basically, the nutrients that you consume will travel through the small and large intestine. Anything that cannot be absorbed will just leave the body through the rectum and be considered waste. Anything that's absorbable, they will cross from the lumen of the intestine and cross the wall and enter the veins, and then the veins will deliver them to the liver, and then the liver will distribute them. So right over here, this picture shows you see how the blood vessels, mesenterics, are connected to the intestine, and then they deliver it up there. So you see the mesenteric and so forth. Now, large size veins are the superior and inferior vena cava. So superior and inferior vena cava delivers the blood to the right atrium. Superior vena cava takes the blood from head, neck, arms, and chest, and inferior vena cava basically delivers the blood from your legs and abdominal cavity, pelvic cavity, and organs and lower limbs. Now, in between the arteries and veins, right in the middle, a connection is capillaries. So capillaries are basically the smallest and most numerous type of blood vessels. They connect the arteries, which carry blood away from the heart, with the veins, which carry basically the blood to the heart. And in the capillaries, some kind of gas exchange and nutrient exchange occurs. And we're going to look at that in details in a second. Since capillaries are very thin and only contain tunica intima, they allow exchange of materials and gases and nutrients and other molecules between the blood and the interstitial fluid. Now, to look at some of the differences, or summarize some of the differences between arteries and blood, we said except two veins, all the veins carry oxygen, pour blood away from the tissue back to the heart. And arteries carry oxygen-rich blood from the heart to the tissue. We said two exceptions, pulmonary and umbilical arteries, and two exceptions over here, pulmonary and umbilical veins. Usually, arteries are positioned deep within the body, and veins are positioned on the surface, superficially. Veins are less muscular. Arteries are more muscular. Veins will collapse if the blood flow stops. Arteries will retain their structure and not collapse. Veins hold more blood. About 75% of your bloods are in the veins. Superior and inferior vena cava are the largest vein. Aorta is the largest artery. Smaller arteries branch off the aorta. Small veins drain into the superior and inferior cava. So one is branching away and the other one is draining in. Veins have valves to help them with moving the blood up against the gravity. So if you look at this one, this is the heart. The blood comes down. It's easier. So you see it goes downhill. It's much easier. It doesn't go against the gravity. But now this is your lower limbs. Exchange occur. After the exchange, this blood has to go back up. Not only that the pressure, let's say that the pressure over here was about 100. By the time it gets over here, the pressure is approximately about 35. When it gets right to the veins, the pressure drops as low as 10. Not only that the pressure dropped, but this blood is going uphill. So it has a lot of problems. So the veins have valves. The valves are basically flaps like this. And those valves are designed in a way that the blood could go up. But if the blood tries to come down, the flaps will just close and would not allow the blood to go backward. And that basically, those flips, those valves, give the blood unidirectional flow. So arteries and veins are basically connected, we said, by capillaries. So capillaries will allow that gas exchange. This one over here, you see over here, is the intestine, because from the intestine everything goes to the liver, and then the liver distributes nutrients and so forth. So you see the superior and vena cava and inferior vena cava, the livers. This picture also shows you the two systems. So that's one over here that you see, that's your systemic circuit. And that's one that you see over here, that's your pulmonary circuit. So pulmonary circuit takes the blood from the heart to the lungs, back to the heart. Systemic from the heart throughout the body and then back to the heart. Now, there are three types of capillaries we have. Those capillaries are, actually, we have two types of capillaries. Continuous capillaries and fenestrated capillaries. But fenestrated capillaries are divided into two groups. Sinusoid fenestrated capillary and regular fenestrated capillary. So you're going to have either continuous capillary or fenestrated capillary. And those are the two types. Let's look at the continuous capillary. So continuous capillaries are the most numerous or the most common type of capillaries. All throughout the body, this is the only capillaries that you see. Those type of capillaries have a complete lining. They supply most of the region of the body, and they are most numerous type of capillaries, as I said earlier. Continuous capillaries are found through all tissues, everywhere in your body. The only exception is the two part that you don't find continuous capillaries are epithelial tissue and the cartilage. So the epithelial tissue, which is a layer of skin which is avascular, and cartilage which is avascular. Fenestrated capillary. So if you look at the fenestrated capillary is the more the one that has pores. So if you look at this capillary over here, so this is the fenestrated capillary. You see these tiny dots. Those tiny dots represents the pores. So molecules and nutrients could go out of those tiny pores, but those pores are not too big. Only smaller molecules could go through those pores, and they will allow that small molecules to go out of the pores. Where do you find the fenestrated capillary? You find them in the kidneys, because kidney is responsible for filtration. You find them in the endocrine glands, like hypothalamus produces those hormones. Those hormones has to go and enter the circulation. You find them in the pituitary gland, pineal gland, thyroid gland. So you find them in all those glands and kidneys that they could basically facilitate this. The third type of capillary, which is also fenestrated capillary, or sinusoid capillary. As you could look at it, they have a larger window or larger pores, and those larger pores allow larger molecules to come out, and larger molecules could just go and enter the circulation enter the circulation or exit the circulation. Where do you find this type of capillary? So you see over here, this is a type of fenestrated capillary. Let me change the color of the pen so you could see. So you see how large gaps are there. So through those gaps, bigger molecules, larger molecules could be found that they could leave the blood vessel, so they could come out, or if a molecule wants to enter, they could enter. So where do you find this kind of capillaries? They're the least numerous capillaries. They're the least common type of capillaries. You find them in the bone marrow. Why? Because bone marrows produce blood cells, and when they produce blood cells, blood cell has to enter the circulation, and when they enter the circulation, they enter it through those gaps. Where else do you find them? You find them, for instance, like in the liver. Liver produces more than 90% of plasma proteins. So those plasma proteins are big. How do they enter the circulation? Through those large gaps. So when the plasma proteins are produced by the hepatocytes, so basically the liver cell produces the proteins, and then those proteins go through the hole and enter the circulation. So that's how they end up in the sinusoid, in the circulation as a plasma proteins. Now, how does the whole exchange between the capillaries, be it continuous or sinusoid or fenestrated, how that exchange occurs? So basically, you have to look at it this way, that what is plasma? Plasma is basically solution. And what is interstitial fluid? It's just solution. So basically, solution is going to leak, molecule is going to leak from the capillaries through gaps or through the cell into the interstitial fluid. Something has to force them out. What is it? So before we discuss that, let's look at the solution. What is solution? Solution part consists of two parts. There consists of solutes and there consists of solvents. And the same thing is with interstitial fluid. There consists of solutes and solvents. What is solute? Solute basically exerts osmotic pressure. So solute is everything that's dissolved in that solution. For instance, like electrolytes are the solutes, glucose is solutes, amino acid in the plasma is solute. So anything that's dissolved in the plasma is solute. What is solvent? Solvent is usually water, majority of the time. When we speak about the human body, it's water, but when we speak about the chemistry, it could be other, but it's water. So where does water basically exert? Hydrostatic pressure. So basically, when you look at it, you have hydrostatic pressure and you have osmotic pressure. So you have hydrostatic pressure inside the capillary and osmotic pressure inside the capillary. You also have hydrostatic and osmotic pressure right over here. So the hydrostatic pressure in the interstitial fluid pushes everything into the capillary, and the hydrostatic pressure in the capillary pushes everything out. Now, whenever the hydrostatic pressure in the interstitial fluid is less than the hydrostatic pressure in the capillary, everything is going to come out. Fluid is going to leak out. If the hydrostatic pressure is high, fluid is going to leak in. So now do you understand the basic? So you have solution, solutes, solvents, osmotic pressure, hydrostatic pressure. It's both in the capillaries and in the interstitial fluid. Now, how do we look at them? So in the capillary, we call it capillary hydrostatic pressure. So there's some kind of hydrostatic pressure that fluid exerts, and we call it capillary or blood colloid pressure. So there's some kind of osmotic pressure. So two things you're going to remember. Hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure is inside the capillary. And interstitial hydrostatic pressure and interstitial colloid osmotic pressure is here too. So in the interstitial fluid, you have two pressure, osmotic and hydrostatic. Inside the capillary, you have osmotic and hydrostatic. So let's look at it, what happens. So initially, right over here, you have high osmotic and hydrostatic pressure. So the pressure in the capillary is high, the pressure in the interstitial fluid is low. So obviously, because you have low pressure in the interstitial fluid and high pressure in the capillaries, molecules and nutrients and gases will move out. They will be forced out because things move from high pressure to low pressure, from high concentration to low concentration. So oxygen, amino acids, nutrients, other nutrients such as glucose, some electrolytes, and so forth, and fluid, a lot of fluid, they all will be forced out of the capillary. This all happens at the arterial end of the capillary. So blood comes in, and right over here you have artery. As soon as it enters the capillary, because that blood has inside the capillary higher pressure, everything is going to move out. So everything is coming out. As this blood is moving to the next region, right over here, nothing is going to happen. Why? Because the pressure inside the capillary and the pressure in the interstitial fluid is the same. So nothing is coming out and nothing is going in. As the blood moves toward the venule end of the capillary, toward the veins, so it could enter the veins. Now at this stage what happens, the pressure inside the capillary is less. So the pressure over here is less, the pressure in the interstitial fluid is high. So what happens, everything moves back in. So right now we're going to see what happens. So oxygen comes out, oxygen is used by the cell produces carbon dioxide goes back in. Nutrients come, say glucose comes out, glucose is used by cell produces some kind of metabolic waste, and that metabolic waste goes back in, and this is delivered back. Now, one of the other things that you're going to notice over here is, so this blood comes from the artery, it goes through the veins, vein diffused oxygen, glucose, amino acids, and those glucose, amino acids are used by this cell, and oxygen is consumed by the cell. The cell produced waste product. That waste product comes back and enters the capillary. Urea is produced. Urea comes back and enters the capillary. Now, one other thing, a lot of fluid leaves the capillary. The fluid leaves the capillary at the arterial end. At the venule end, that fluid goes back in. But the amount of fluid that leaves the capillary is much higher compared to the amount of fluid that goes in. Let's use hypothetical number. Let's say 100 ml of the fluid leaves the capillary, came out. Out of that 100, let's assume that 80 ml went back into the capillary at the venule end. What happened to the other 20 ml? Other 20 ml of that fluid will enter the lymphatic capillary. Lymphatic capillary will drain into the lymph vessels, and the lymph vessels will drain it back into the circulation back. And this diagram shows you the same thing. So arterial brings blood, goes to the capillary. So at the arterial end, you see there is more pressure inside the capillary. So basically, this diagram shows that the difference in pressure is 10 millimeter of mercury higher compared to the interstitial fluid. Because there's more pressure, everything goes out. Right over here, the pressure is minus. That means like the pressure inside the capillary is less compared to the interstitial fluid. So everything comes in. But what happens is a lot of fluid goes out in addition to nutrient and gases. So some of that fluid will come back in. But what happened to that excess fluid? We say that excess fluid will enter the lymphatic capillaries. There's precapillary, so how the blood flow is basically regulated. There's a precapillary sphincters. So let's say that this region has precapillary sphincters and you're doing a lot of leg work. So the blood flow to this region should increase. So how does that regulate? So the sphincters over here will constrict and the blood flow to this region will be restricted. the blood flow to this region will increase. And those precapillary basically regulate the flow of blood to different regions of the body based on how much oxygen or energy that body part needs. The other way of regulating by endocrine system, for instance, like for example, when there's low blood pressure and less oxygen, erythropoietin is produced. Erythropoietin is basically increasing the number of red blood cells and consequently compensating for that lack of oxygen. Natriuretic peptides are released in response to high blood pressure. When your blood pressure is high, you generate natriuretic peptide. Why? Because when your blood pressure is high, that means you have high volume. So when you have too much volume, what happens is more blood is going to end up in the more volume, or more blood is going to end up in the atriums. Atriums going to stretch. So when they stretch, that stretching is going to stimulate release of this hormone, and that hormone will consequently bring the blood back to normal. If your blood pressure is too low, you're going to produce an enzyme, renin, that we're going to look at it. So this is how natriuretic peptides regulate the blood. So basically, when your blood pressure is high, your atriums stretch, releases natriuretic peptide, and what it does, it basically goes and increases sodium loss at the kidney. Because sodium is salt, you're going to lose more water. It increases water loss at the urine. So you're going to produce more diluted urine. You're going to produce more volume of urine. It's going to reduce thirst. You're not going to drink any water. It's going to block antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormones are blocked. Now you lose more water with your urine. Again, your urine production increases, and it also vasodilates the blood vessels. So all of those actions lead to what? To increase the volume. So decrease the volume. So all of them will decrease the volume, and that decreasing volume will consequently normalize the blood pressure. But what if the blood pressure is high? If the blood pressure is high, low, your kidneys will produce an enzyme called renin. Renin will go and basically convert angiotensin to angiotensin. So I will take this angiotensin to convert it to angiotensin 2. In order to convert that, you need that enzyme renin. Once you produce angiotensin 2 will be converted to angiotensin 1 is going to be converted to angiotensin 2 at the lungs. And once it's converted to angiotensin 2 will produce antidiuretic hormone. And antidiuretic hormone will basically increase retention of water by the kidney. And that means like you're going to produce more concentrated urine. Least amount of water is going to be released with urine. It will also stimulate thirst. So now you're thirsty, you're consuming more water. It will also stimulate production of aldosterone by adrenal gland. And antidiuretic hormone, by the way, is produced by the pituitary gland, released by the pituitary gland. They're produced by the hypothalamus, but released by the pituitary gland. What the aldosterone does, aldosterone basically increases retention of sodium. Again, because sodium is salt, the more sodium is retained, more water is going to follow it, and water is going to be retained too. And also, the final action that it has is going to lead to constriction of the blood vessel. And so when we look at it, constriction of blood vessel basically increases the pressure. You're retaining sodium, you're increasing the water. You're retaining water, you're producing less urine. You're thirsty. All of them will lead to what? They will lead to one thing. They will increase the volume. And when they increase the volume increase means the blood pressure is going to go back to normal. So basically those two hormones regulate the blood pressure. It could be also regulated by other, sensing some of the gases. For instance, like if it senses oxygen level is decreased, it will produce or the blood flow will increase to that region. If it senses that there is too much oxygen. So if you have too much oxygen, carbon dioxide here, that means what? That all oxygen has been used by those tissue, send me more oxygen. If you have low level of oxygen here, that means what? I need more oxygen, deliver more oxygen. Or could be lactic acid. Let's look at this one, for instance. What is the role of lactic acid? So basically, this is the cell right over here. So this is the cell. So glucose enters the cell. That glucose is converted to pyruvate. Pyruvate has two choices. One choice, the first choice, so preferred choice, to enter mitochondria and convert to acetyl coenzyme A. And then acetyl coenzyme A will be metabolized to produce energy. But there's one condition. The condition is that in order for pyruvate to enter enter mitochondria, there has to be oxygen present. If there is no oxygen, pyruvate cannot enter mitochondria and become acetyl coenzyme A. So what is the second choice, or not preferred choice? If there is no oxygen, pyruvate will have no choice but to convert to lactic acid. So now what happens? If you have too much lactic acid in the body, what is that an indication? That's indication that, hey, I don't have enough oxygen. If I had enough oxygen, pyruvate would have entered mitochondria and would have become acetyl coenzyme A. Because I don't have enough oxygen, pyruvate had no choice but to become lactic acid. So send me fresh oxygen. So that's how basically it regulates the flow of blood and so forth. And with this, we're going to conclude our lecture. Thank you.